there are enough signs that the global economy may be slowing down, but one thing's for certain, the war for talent is not. So I just wanted to do sort of a walk around the world and illustrate with some facts about why that is and why it's likely to continue for some time. So if we start in the U.S., the U.S. Department of Education says that over the next couple of decades, it's estimated that 60% of all the new jobs created, that only 20% of the people have the skills needed for those jobs. So in some ways, if you thought of, if we can get the U.S. economy churning again and get back into the game in terms of what our distinguished speaker said today is a world we've never seen before, what's likely to happen is that we will still have a significant talent gap for two reasons. One is we actually don't have the skills necessary for the jobs we're creating. And the second thing, which is interesting more about demographics, is that the U.S. plans to graduate about 200,000 people between now and 2018, and we'll have almost 2 million people planning to leave the workforce in terms of their planned retirement as the exodus of some of the baby boomers. Now, with the economy the way it is, some of us may be hanging around a bit longer than we had anticipated, but even given that, I mean, 10 to 20% graduates to fill that number of vacancies is a significant role to fill. And therefore, we're left with a significant talent gap. If I move over to Africa for a moment, Africa is a really interesting story. We have an office there, and we're doing a lot of work on the continent. And at least in my lifetime, in living and working in places in Africa, I've never seen the continent so alive and so vibrant with a sense of hope and promise about what's coming next. So as a fact, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies are now in Africa. So the likes of Nigeria, Mozambique, Ghana, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and others. I mean, growing at almost double-digit rates in some cases. So it's just phenomenal in terms of what's going on in Africa. Now, it's largely driven by, the needs for oil, gas, mining, minerals, and agriculture elsewhere in the world, and particularly in India and China and Southeast Asia. But Africa is now playing a role they've never played before and has the promise of being great at what they're trying to do. Now, the downside of this is, with all these new jobs that are potentially created, there is a significant skill gap in technical and leadership skills. Again, when you think about the industries I just named, we need mining engineers, geologists, civil engineers, etc., and people to lead large-scale projects, lead business units, lead people and through that all around the continent. So, they've got their challenges, and more time you spend there, you realize that the single greatest limit to Africa's growth is going to be their ability to create this level of technical and leadership talent to close the gap and deliver on the promises they have to their folks. If I move over to China, it's very interesting. I mean, if you have to give the Chinese credit. If they put their mind to something, they know how to scale it. So, they have one of the highest child literacy rates in the world at almost 99%. Quite a fascinating statistic. But on the other end, as they scaled higher education, one of the downsides of that is that they're turning out lots of graduates, but only about 10% or 15% are actually, business ready, or they would say MNC, multinational corporation ready. So it's not about having the number of graduates, but it's what they're learning and how close they are to being business ready that is really the significance in the gap. If we turn our attention here to India, now you know all of these things and more better than I do, but a couple of interesting things come to mind. One is you have such a great asset in that you have a younger workforce coming through. The benefit of more younger people versus the cliff we spoke about in the western part of the world is just such a tremendous asset. Smart, talented, hardworking folks ready to make a difference, improve their own lives, and improve the world as they do so. But there's two key things that seem to stand out. Again, part of this natural asset we need to take advantage of is somewhat nullified by the fact that, again, some of the graduates that we're turning out are not actually business ready. Business ready in the technical sense, business ready in the ability to really run a business and do those sorts of things. So. And the other part is there are a number of key sectors that India has pinned its hopes and aspirations for growth around, and there are clearly some significant talent gaps in those, including infrastructure, organized retail, aviation, energy, you know the list and you know the problems, you're actually living those. So I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts here as we move to the next slide. One is, given the demographic shifts we see in the world and the lack of our education systems around the world to keep up with the pace of change in business, we actually have pretty dramatic supply and demand imbalances going forward. We have them today, and our belief is they're only going to get more so in the future. Second, the more CEOs that we speak with, and you can read other studies, etc., but the more CEOs that we speak with, this notion about key talent gaps is becoming much higher on their own list of strategic and operational risks, right? So it's no longer about doing good things for people because people are a great asset, being nice and equitable. This is a serious strategic issue that now is at board level in many companies around the world, and everybody's trying to figure out what it is they need to do about this. So if you couple this supply and demand imbalance with a higher importance for our own CEOs, I think we're left to conclude that companies like ourselves are going to shoulder the burden of more development and figuring out ways to be more innovative in this space to get people ready to take on these challenges in the future. So I'll leave you with whether this is good news or bad news. We certainly have some work to do. Next point I want to make is we do a piece of research, one significant piece of research every year. We're in the midst of completing our own CEO study this year. And so I want to share with you a couple of quotes and a couple of stories that illustrate some of the ways the context in which leaders need to lead is changing significantly. So a couple of stories here. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see one is the degrees of freedom and control over the key variables are less. And this comes from a CEO here in India who heads up one of the largest biscuit manufacturing companies. And so the story was around the following thing. You can imagine that for a biscuit company, wheat is an absolutely critical ingredient. So they monitor that, watch supply and demand fluctuations, build pricing models as one of their key things in terms of their supply chain, and do all of those things on a regular basis. The CEO said that one night while they were asleep on the other side of the world, there were a couple of very significant funds that had information both from the United States and Argentina and a few other places, put some things together, and decided to make huge amounts of investments in grain futures. So as this one fund led the way, other funds watched this fund do that and also did the same, and within 3 weeks, wheat prices had jumped 30%. An unprecedented jump. And so the CEO's point was, even on something as critical to our business as wheat, we now need to widen our purview and really think about the world in different ways. We now live in a globally interdependent, connected world. And so even though we're watching that none of the fundamentals are changing in India, things happened on the other side of the earth that just changed every business plan we have. And how do we actually keep up with that sort of knowledge? So I thought that was an interesting story and also really illustrates some of these points. Another one is around complexity. So the quote is, "We need to stop the blind belief in models." Now, this one comes, interestingly enough, from a CEO of an insurance company. I don't know how many of you are in the insurance business, but if you are, insurance companies love models. We've got to do analysis. We've got to peg down, how else do you gauge risk? And so there were two really interesting points. One was that he made the point that it's really seductive for us to fall into the thinking that all we need to do in this more complex world is just build more complex models. And so, it's one of the things that gives us great comfort. It has the same degree of control, but he's more and more convinced that that is not going to be the answer to this question, but there are other things they need to do. Corollary to that was that one of the things they wanted to do was they're in Europe, and they actually wanted to figure out, they're looking at this agriculture sector booming in Africa. Africa still has about half of the arable land left on the earth. And so it's going to be booming for quite some time around agriculture. So they want to get in the game, and they want to figure out how they could insure small, medium-sized farms in the eastern part of Africa. So he said he sent away some of his best people. They came back, they had the model, they had a meeting, they went through everything, and he said, he was very convinced that as smart as these guys were, they really didn't understand the problem. So what they did instead was they went and they bought farmland in the middle of this sector. They hired people and they grew a subset of the crops that are, indigenous there. And by doing so, they actually learned, by being in the context, experiencing the problem, understanding things up close and personal about what's happening, it was a much better way for them to start to think about the problem than to model it from the other side of the world. The other thing that happened from that is many of the local farmers now come to that farm to ask about best practice and a number of things. So it's actually helped them de-risk the farms that they insure. And so it's another model that they've come up with to start to think about how to deal with this complexity and risk. On the lower right-hand side was a quote from another very well-known CEO here in India, and it sort of speaks to the same problem but a different angle on it, right? So when he was speaking about how do I deal with the pace of change and the complexity we're dealing with, he said, forget models. There's a couple of things that are really going to matter, and one of them is it's now more important to have people where they can pick up on the changes rapidly and actually stay close to our clients so we understand which way things are going and be adaptable. So he said, if I had to pick modeling versus context and being there and picking up on these things and more sense-making more rapidly, he said, it's the latter, not the former. So that's another one. And on the upper left-hand side around unpredictability, there's a quote there that says, things that were valued before are valued completely differently today. From a CEO who runs a global recruitment firm, and so he said one of the things we were most proud of and really was at the heart of our business model and our value proposition was that we had insider proprietary knowledge on 3 million people, who they were, how much they made, what they wanted to do, their levels of mobility, etc. He goes, 2 years later, with LinkedIn, 3 million is nothing. Whatever I was holding on to as the asset that differentiated us the most, has now sort of been shared with the world. So they actually also, in this less predictable world, we find ourselves really at the heart of rethinking our business models in very distinctive ways. So I say all that to leave you with a couple of ideas here, and then we'll go to the next one. But you've heard all of the words, so it's, unpredictability, complexity, the pace of change, global interdependency are not new words, and they're not new concepts. But one of the quotes that I thought was instructive on the left-hand side there is, we are facing challenges we all talk about, but in all honesty, nobody's good at them. And I think that really it strikes at the heart of what we have as a challenge as people who develop leaders, and leaders who are going to lead the business in this never-before-seen world, is that we all know what the problem is, but how do we actually get better at this, and how do we change our own mental models and orthodoxies of how we think we're going to solve this by using the old means against old ways and actually create some new things around that. So, last one, and then I'll turn it over to our panel members here. So from our CEO study and from other work that we've done with clients around the world, we've been trying to make sense of at least what are some of the new critical challenges facing leaders. Now, I want to make 2 points. So this is not offered in a way to say this is your new leadership model, get rid of all the competency work you've done. This is, and again, it is not an exhaustive list. So there's many things up here that leaders need to do that this does not cover. What we tried to do is distill down from all of this information, what are the critical challenges facing leaders that they are most important and probably least prepared for, if you thought of it that way. And so the model breaks out along 2 ways in 4 domains. One is challenges around people and relational things, and then challenge around information, analytics, decision-making, and organization. And then we have an internal and an external piece. So I'll just start quickly down the bottom left, if you will, around talent. Every company that we're working with around the world, and they're all different, and they all have different versions of this, is very worried about talent engagement. So if you thought about, as we saw on the first slide, that the supply and demand imbalances that are going on in the world, the leverage for really highly talented people shifts to the person, not the organization. So they actually have more leverage in this talent marketplace. Secondly, if you take the demographic shifts, we're now managing, 4 generations of people sometimes in a single workplace. But many of the younger folks, have very different expectations about work and their life and how this fits, and very different expectations about, what they're going to get out of work and how they'll be treated at work and how they'll be taken care of, etc. And so one thing we say is often that the new generation, the meaning is the new money. And so thinking about how you connect with folks and do those sorts of things. So when you think about creating an environment of high engagement, one of the things we believe is that the fundamental building block of highly engaged people and organization are going to be the quality and of connectedness and inspiration in your leaders at multiple levels. So yes, I would say the HR systems need to be aligned. They need to be supportive. They need to make sure that they're doing the right things. But it is not a systems and processes problem. Inspiration and connectedness is a human problem. And how we're going to do that with leaders is a very dramatic shift in how we think about that. I was thinking about, was it Adam Critchley who was here, right? Gilchrist, sorry about that. Adam Gilchrist, the cricket player. And his story, stuck with me yesterday. If you use this sort of model as an example, from an HR standpoint, Adam already knew what his job was, so there was some level of role description about his position he played and what he had to do. He already had a contract, so he knew what his salary was. Those things were taken care of. And you could go through the other things that were put in place for someone like Adam, that, he was on a great team with good peers, and he had a number of things that the HR folks would do. But as he described the story, it wasn't until the captain came in, right, and was one-on-one with him and said, here's what we need to do this weekend, and here's why you are so important, and here are the things we expect of you, that I think it was Adam who said, this is when I felt like I was the only person in the world, right? And it wasn't a systems and processes issue. All of those things were predicates to lead you to this point, but it was that one-on-one conversation that described the meaning of what we're doing and what we want to achieve. So leave you with that in terms of a couple of things that all of our, and I think we'll hear from some of this from some of our panel members as well. On the upper left, stakeholders. Look, very quickly, we have more of our clients actually find that a larger part of their strategy is predicated on being pan-regional, being global, being something other than just being good in our home country. And if that's the case, then we find that most of those people are now playing with a more complex set of stakeholders with a more complex set of issues. But even here at home, right? In your businesses in India, it's becoming more complex. So on one hand, you know what business you're in, you know you have to make money for share owners, but you've got to deal with communities, you've got to deal with customers, you've got to deal with a whole series of things. So on the left-hand side, big picture, if you will, these are things that if you think about the leaders that we've groomed, most of us have gotten to where we are because we have great technical abilities, we've been able to execute, and kind of have done no harm on the people side, if you will. Right? And we're describing a world here that sort of flips that on its head, that we're going to spend much more of our time engaged with people in the company, engaged with people outside of the company. And we're just having groomed leaders to be prepared to do this. And so if you believe that those two things on the left-hand side are actually also escalating up on your CEO's list, then we have to prepare leaders to be better at those things. One last thing around that is, if you dig down a couple levels deeper, I do think there's something else sort of afoot here that we have to grapple with when we think about development needs. For me, in some ways, the basis for authority is changing, right? So and what I mean by that is, on the bottom left, we had positional power and hierarchy. You could rely on that to a large degree. It's evaporating, and we need inspiration and influence. On the upper left, it was contracts. If I could contract with a government, contract with somebody, I just did that, sort of mollified and made everybody else, go away, whatever I had to do. Not going to be that way anymore, right? More people involved in our business from the outside, more people we need to inspire from the inside. On the upper right, global mindset, I think we all know, that whether you're running a business here or whether you're actually, expanding your business elsewhere in the world, building leaders that have a wider angle lens on the world is just critical. So how they think about cultures, markets, and a number of things going on. And then on the bottom right should really be no surprise, particularly here in a fast-paced, fast growth market like India. When you think about the future, how we actually help leaders think about the future is not so much a linear plan, but a range of scenarios that could unfold and prepare ourselves for. Sort of like the quote that we saw on the first side. And if you believe Darwin, which I think is becoming more and more true in this never-before-seen world, it's not going to be the fastest or the strongest, but those who are most adaptable, who will actually survive and win. And so we see innovation as linked to adaptability. So innovation in all its incarnations seems to be something that we really need to have leaders be able to know more about, be able to lead, because it's now not only about differentiation, but survival in many ways. So we'll come back to that and can have a bit of a chat, but before I go any further with that one, I would actually like to ask